From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus.
Thanks for joining us for 22 News in Focus. I'm Ciara Speller. During summer vacation, students can expect to have some learning loss. And when they return to the classroom, academic progress is regained. The coronavirus pandemic forced schools to close and students of all ages to learn from home. This highlighted the gaps in education inequities, especially in rural and economically depressed communities and minority-dominant schools. Issues such as lack of access to internet, a safe and secure environment to learn, and one-on-one instruction impacted learning quality. So joining me now to discuss what schools and students need to get back on the learning track is Ed Lambert, the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education. Ed, we thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me, Ciara. Appreciate it.
So first, I just want to ask you, what is your background in education?
Well, I have been really fortunate to have had some great opportunities in my life, including parents who, like so many of us, wanted to ensure their kids got a great education. I served on my school committee locally for 10 years. I served in the legislature. I was the mayor of Fall River, Massachusetts for 12 years. But it's a great source of pride to be with an organization like the Mass Business Alliance for Education. This organization was founded 30 years ago by Paul Revel and Jack Rennie. It is a nonprofit statewide organization made up of business leaders who are very concerned about ensuring that there's a high quality level of education for all of our students.
Yeah, and just have you talk a little bit more about your mission.
Sure. The mission dates back to the late 80s and early 90s and was really grounded in equity. At the time, property taxes meant that as the primary way of funding education, that kids in lower income communities were getting much less of an educational opportunity than in wealthier communities. The state's business leaders came together and said, let's support education with more funding from the state, but let's also make sure that we hold ourselves as a Commonwealth accountable, that we measure progress, that we set some targets, that we have some accountability. And so it's been that marriage of both funding and reform that really has helped propel Massachusetts in many ways to first in the nation status relative to academic achievement of our students.
All right, and I want to ask you if you have any community partnerships and what do they do?
Well, we have a number of affiliates. There are 38 affiliate organizations who are part of our umbrella network. We have several out in Western Mass, highlighted in the Springfield area with Springfield Chamber of Commerce, the Springfield Business Leaders for Education, the Western Mass Economic Development Council, Chambers of Commerce, large employers. Our network covers 31,000 employers in Massachusetts. And so we have a lot of corporations and business leaders very much engaged in partnerships with public schools across the state.
Yeah, of course, we love to hear about that local connection. And I also want to ask you, why should communities be concerned about learning loss?
Well, certainly this last 2 years has been really disruptive to everyone's lives for a whole lot of reasons. But the learning loss that our students, not only in Massachusetts, but across the nation and around the world have suffered potentially has the potential to have students off track very significantly. Unless we can accelerate learning and get students back on track and put them on the right path, you're talking about lost wages for students. You're talking about impacts to the state's competitive position. There are a lot of reasons, both from a talent pipeline perspective, but also from an equity perspective, as to why we need to act with some urgency to try to recover that lost learning and accelerate academic progress for students.
And so your organization has a report that addresses learning loss and keeping students on track. Who would be using that information in this report and, to what benefit?
Well, we have had the opportunity to take a look at some best practices from around the country relative to ways in which we can invest using some of the state money that's been made available, some of the federal relief dollars that have come from Washington directly to school districts to try to address learning loss. Massachusetts, like other states around the country, have received the largesse that comes from the federal government in the way of federal COVID relief dollars. Massachusetts public schools in 3 rounds of federal relief funding became entitled to almost $2.8 billion in funding. This is a significant amount of funding, and we cannot waste that opportunity. And so we have put together a blueprint, shared it with school committees and superintendents as to the kinds of strategies that districts can employ. We've also put some recommendations out for state policies so that the state can help guide and leverage that and make sure we're making the most of the opportunity that's here.
I want to move now to this. So what innovations has the pandemic created that may help improve education as students get back into the classroom?
Well, you certainly think about how, parents and students really have been through, as have teachers, have been through a real trying time. And yet there really are some lessons learned and some ways we've identified that we might be able to utilize technology very differently. That the investments in technology, getting kids devices, getting them set up with broadband, might allow us to be flexible, for instance, with schedules for high schoolers. A lot of high schoolers were really impacted if they came from an economically distressed family, where they might have had to help the family economically by going out and getting some part-time work. There's no real need for us to rush back into the same, 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock schedule for high schoolers. When we can deliver some content online to them, we can let kids and students learn at night and on weekends, have a hybrid model that brings them into school for some of the time and allows the use of technology to help advance student learning. A lot of states and school districts have used something called a master teacher concept, where you take the teachers who might be best equipped to teach, let's say, 8th grade science or 6th grade math, and they deliver the content to hundreds of students at the same time in a style and in a manner that really is high quality. And then the students' classroom teachers kind of dive into that content with the students and help deliver that. So technology has really, as tired as we might all be with it, has at least some very new ways, we think, that you could innovate with teaching and learning.
All right, Ed Lambert, thank you for your insight. And when we return, we'll be discussing the most recent Mcas results. You're watching 22 News in Focus. We're back here now with 22 News in Focus, and today we're talking about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on education with Ed Lambert, the executive director of the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education. Students were required to take the Mcas this past spring, even though many were still not in school. In September, the statewide Mcas test results from the spring 2021 exams were released, and the data revealed that many more students had gaps in their knowledge of math and English language arts, compared to students in the same grades before the COVID-19 pandemic. And fewer students meet or exceeded grade level expectations. So Ed, I want to ask you, have you reviewed the Mcas results?
Well, it was really important for us to have the Mcas this year. As people know, it was canceled in 2020, in the first year of the pandemic. And so we went almost 2 years without getting data. And this is really a time when we need to get that data, find out how students are impacted. And so the data tells us several things. First, of course, there were drops in performance across the board in a whole range of ways, in both English language arts and in math. There were drops regardless of the kind of district. There were decreases in performance in urban districts, suburban districts, rural districts, and even in high performing and low performing districts. There were some districts that are amongst the best in the Commonwealth who saw pretty significant drops in performance from 2019 to 2021. And of course, that's very unusual because from one year to the next, you almost always see at least incremental increases. And so it's clear that there was some real significant impacts in the learning, not unlike what happened in other parts of the country. The decreases were more significant in math than they were in English. And that's probably a reflection of the fact that math is a much more difficult subject to teach remotely. And so to the extent that we had a lot of students learning remotely, math suffered more significantly. There were also bigger drops in performance in younger grades. And that pretty much suggests that the younger the student, the more difficult it was for them to learn remotely, that maybe high school students were either more digitally literate or better adaptable to remote learning. But some very specific data that came from the Mcas shows that in math, where the biggest drops were, Massachusetts saw a 16 percentage point drop from 49% of students meeting expectations to only 33%. And it was a little less in the 10th grade, but still pretty significant. English language arts dropped less. There was actually a slight increase in English at the 10th grade level. Again, probably due to the fact that high school students are more adaptable to remote. But the last and most telling point is that achievement gaps widened during the pandemic. Massachusetts, even though it is first in the nation in terms of academic status, has some of the biggest achievement gaps anywhere in the country. And that was made worse by the pandemic. In fact, if you look at third grade English scores, Black students dropped from 38 to 32% in performance. Latino students even more, from 38 to 28%. White students dropped only 2% from 63 to 61%. So you can see the impacts for students of color, students from economically distressed families and or backgrounds was somewhere 3 to 5 times more challenging for students who were already traditionally and historically underserved. And so with income inequality, with the fact that a lot of those families were most impacted by the pandemic in terms of maybe economically, parents possibly losing jobs or not having the resources, for instance, to hire tutors or to have devices, we certainly have seen a greater impact to students already challenged because of the pandemic. And that means we're going to have to redouble our efforts in terms of closing those achievement gaps.
Yeah, some really important stats right there and factors as well. So the big question now is, what can be done to help students who fell behind catch up to their peers?
So there are some strategies that are best practices nationally that we hope districts will undertake. The first is assessing students when they get back into classrooms. There are a lot of diagnostic assessments that you can give that are standards-based. Every child may have been affected very differently depending on their home circumstances. And so identifying very clearly in a personalized way for every student what they've lost is the first and most important thing to happen. There's something called high dosage tutoring that school districts around the country are using, where you take groups of 2 and 3 students, no more than that, during the school day, and you give them intensive tutoring in math or English 3 or 4 times a week for 45 minutes to an hour. You can actually make up a year's worth of lost ground in just 2 or 3 months with a high impact tutoring strategy. Extended learning time, extending the school day or the school year. Acceleration academies, where you bring students back in during school vacation time and really give them intensive accelerated learning in English and math. There are ways to bring learning back and we hope, particularly with the funding that's been made available, that districts are going to take advantage of those strategies.
And I want to move now to this. So with students being back in school full time, do you think that Mcas scores will improve in the next round of testing?
Well, we certainly hope so. There's no reason not to. And in fact, if they don't, then we will have failed ourselves. We can't blame students if we don't think innovatively and creatively and with some urgency on how to do that. Of course, we don't know what the pandemic will bring even over the next 6 months, but we should continue to test so that we can identify where the challenges are and where the strengths are. And hopefully we'll get students back on track and make the progress that they deserve.
And lastly, and just quickly, I want to ask you, how's your organization engaged in closing the digital equity gap?
Well, it certainly was something that had a very harsh spotlight shown on it when school shut down, and nobody, of course, could have anticipated that. It became really clear who the haves were and who the have-nots were. And students who come from homes where they don't have devices, or you've got a number of kids having to share one device, or they don't have sound, strong, accessible, and affordable internet, then that's a real problem for students. It's always been a problem, particularly for those students in terms of homework gaps. But in these learning gaps, that became a significant issue. We heard stories of parents who would drive their kids and sit in the car in a Starbucks parking lot because they didn't have internet at home. So our business leaders have been very strong advocates for closing those gaps, making sure every student has a device, making sure that every family can get some support for broadband and internet access. And this is something that a lot of folks hadn't counted on. A lot of families need technical assistance as well. parents and students getting onto Zoom or their Chromebooks or whatever device they might have. That's something improving digital literacy is something we should be doing now in all of our school programs.
All right, thank you. Really important information right there. And we'll continue the conversation after the break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Back here now with 22 News in Focus, and today we're talking about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on education with Ed Lambert, the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education. Currently, schools in Massachusetts are still open for in-person learning with no major coronavirus outbreaks. The pandemic gave everyone involved in education the opportunity to rethink best practices and for teaching and learning. So, Ed, what are some of the new ideas and innovations that may work to help public education move forward?
Well, we talked about some of the ways in which we can use technology. I mean, we can make some significant technology investments that allow us to teach and learn in very different ways in our classrooms. We also, I think, have learned, particularly from the business community perspective, that high schools need much more flexibility, that we can't have kids on a pathway to nowhere. There are only so many vocational and career tech programs. We've got to try to make all of our high schools look much more like pathways for students that put them on a path to success, either in college and or career. It's not enough anymore, clearly, to just get a high school diploma. So having some flexible career pathways, utilizing technology, doing some blended learning where students can learn both in person and through technology, we think those are the kinds of innovations that we should really embrace post-pandemic.
And I just want to move now to this. The job market and how business is conducted has also changed. The Baker administration has been supporting training and skill building programs in the construction trades and manufacturing industries in order to meet the industry needs across the state. They've also provided millions of dollars to vocational technical high schools as part of the Career Technical Initiative. And that will provide training for students and adults. So how can public schools prepare students for high-tech and high-skills careers?
Well, we are very supportive of the governor's initiatives in that area. There are some real innovative partnerships taking place where traditional high schools and vocational schools are sharing space and changing student scheduling so that we can get more students into some of the vocational spaces so that they can match their academic attainment with some practical technical skills. But there are several things that we advocate as an organization. The first is expansion of something called early college, where we have high schools partner with community colleges or the university or state university system to start to provide college credit in high school, and in particular within a career pathway. Maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's finance, but giving kids a head start so that they get interested and engaged and involved. Early college helps kids participate at much greater levels and with much greater success in college. Giving students in high school industry recognized credentials, providing significant partnerships that give internships and mentorships to students, doing much more with work-based learning opportunities, giving students credit for work that they do in career pathways outside the school building. Those kinds of things we think are really necessary to reshape education as we know it and prepare for a future of work that we think is going to be very, very different.
And what types of incentives could be offered to school districts that offer industry certifications?
Well, actually, MBAE is a sponsor with Senator Eric Lesser and Representative Jeff Roy as our lead sponsors on legislation that would mirror in Massachusetts what's happening in states like Ohio and Florida and other places where high schools actually get a cash incentive for every industry recognized credential in a high demand, a high growth industry area. Would give a $750 stipend for each high school for every credential that they hand a student. Other states have significantly grown their programs. We don't do enough of it here in Massachusetts. We think it's not just for voc schools, but for all public schools, all public high schools, to be able to give kids credentials that make them marketable and that quite honestly ignite their interest in a particular career pathway, we think will be a much better approach.
And I want to ask you, should there be more access to early college, and what form would that take?
Well, Massachusetts is getting there. The governor and the legislature deserve significant credit. This year, they doubled funding for early college through our advocacy and others. We were able to do that, and we'll continue to work with the governor and the legislature to grow that. There's a model in other states that we don't yet have here in Massachusetts called P-TECH, where students stay in high school for 6 years, but when they graduate, or less, but when they graduate with an associate's degree, free to them. We think that in a particular technical area, and they get first crack at a job in that industry based on who the industry partner is. So those kinds of innovations, helping prepare kids for college and career, they are out there. Those models are out there. Massachusetts has been a little bit slow to adopt them. And we really hope that will accelerate. And now that we recognize the competitive position of the state is going to be very different, I think, because of how the pandemic has affected worldwide commerce.
And so we know that the cost of higher education can really be a deterrent. So what options are there for reducing or even eliminating the high cost of higher education?
Well, certainly things like early college and P-TECH, those programs are free. And so we've seen examples with our early college programs across the state where we had students graduating from high school with their associate's degree for free. So that reduces college debt and the like. We know that the federal government had taken a look at free community college. We need to continue to try to invest, particularly at the community college level. There's a significant return on investment when the state public dollars help make higher education affordable. There's a return on investment that works for everybody. And so we need to keep working at making sure that we meet the financial need of students who not only have trouble paying for college, but when they're in college, have housing costs, food costs, and the like. We've got to figure out a better way as a society, and certainly Massachusetts should lead on that in terms of getting college attainment at even higher levels, particularly for first-generation college students.
All right, thank you, Ed, and we'll have the final word when we return. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You've been watching 22 News in Focus, and today we've been talking about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on education with Ed Lambert, the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education. Ed, we want to thank you so much for being on the program.
Sierra, thanks for having me. We really appreciate the focus that you all have placed on this really important issue.
Thank you.